When I say buenos dias, I mean buenos dias because I'm barely waking up myself here. I'm California time. And our wonderful, wonderful guest today, Victor Jorges, he's in Miami or he's in Fort Lauderdale and he's already ready to go out of work. He's been working all night and I'm barely waking up. So, you can sort of sense a time shift here, but I want to thank Victor for joining us right after work today. Thank you very much, Victor, for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. Let's begin with the program in terms of what we're trying to look for. This is a role model series, and I asked Victor, I ran into him through a series of networks, and then Victor graciously accepted to be here. And what I asked him to do is to bring his experience, his background, his passion for broadcasting, for the whole idea of broadcasting journalism. I'm not going to take him so much into the future yet, but I want to take them backwards in time. Part of the storytelling process is, where did you get the inspiration, the idea that you were going to get into broadcasting?
Well, I think a lot of it actually has to do. My mom studied journalism. She never pursued it as a career, but she studied it. And honestly, my mom, even though she never actually like stepped foot in the workforce, she's the best journalist and storyteller I know. She's the first and last person to see all of my work. So I think it definitely stems from that. Obviously, my mom. And then I remember it was middle school, so I was like 11 or 12. They had the option to join the yearbook staff in my middle school, Silver Trail. And I got into the program. It was a very small group, and I remember just like taking photos and loving it, the design and everything. And then funny enough, later on I found out that when I found out I was probably like 18, 19, my dad in his dorm when he studied here, he had like a dark room in his dorm, which I still think is like the coolest thing in the world. So I have all his equipment. It's like the Canon A1, so it's like the very first one. He has like all the toys. So I think maybe both my parents just threw it into me, just like being creative, and they've always really kind of like encouraged that, like, go get it, do what really makes you happy thing, which I'm very lucky to say that. And then honestly, I haven't, like I was telling you earlier, if I didn't have this as a career option, like this passion as also being able to make a job out of it, I don't know what I would be doing, because ever since I started taking pictures when I was 12 and now I'm 23, I haven't stopped.
There's a lot of situations where parents put their children into all these environments where all these options are possible. And there's a plethora of background in your family that can support it. But sometimes the child says, I don't want any of this. I want something totally different. It seems to me that you sort of followed the path and just sort of added to it, and it sort of worked off each other as well. Did you sort of begin to form an idea that I'm going to get into television, I'm going to get into radio, I'm going to get into these at a very early age?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, I learned photography pretty early on. So I learned photography first, and then I kind of took all those skills that I learned and put them into, then in freshman year of high school, my video packages, so my news packages. So I shot everything with like a 50 millimeter. My work was always very clean, very pretty journalism, which is what I used to like really be like, this is it. Like everything needs to be super pretty all the time. But yeah, I would say that it's always been very clear to me that this is what I need to do. And I guess also because I've been working on it for such a long time, I started realizing that I was kind of good at it. And so when people when people tell you like, hey, this is really good, and they tell you that constantly and from such an early age, you're like, well, what else am I like? What am I gonna do? Be a doctor and like not know if I'm good at it? So if I'm already getting those skills and getting that feedback, you kind of keep improving because it fuels you.
Okay, the word good is obviously philosophical. How do you define good back then in that time?
Well, I went to a high school that certified their students. So we had a couple programs. We had like culinary program, we had early childhood, and we had we had television production as a certification. And so part of that whole situation was being able to compete at the state level, like district, state, and national level. And there was just a series. I remember my sophomore year, I didn't win anything, and I was like devastated. And then I took that summer, and I was like, you know what? Like I gotta get better. I gotta get better. So I guess that I measured my success, which ironically now it doesn't mean anything because I can't go to a job and be like, when I was 17, I got first place in the country for whatever, when I was in high school. But in that moment, it was like my golden ticket that I was like, I'm invincible. Yeah, that's how you measure the good or the success.
In the process, I think you and everyone else who was successful, we all have stories of the idea when we're not successful, the challenges, the moments that we sort of something happened and we drew back on that. Did you have that moment when you sort of went into a deep doubt?
Absolutely, yeah. So I've always been like, I love multimedia journalism, which if people listening don't know what that is just kind of like taking one story and just, giving you an article, giving you a photo essay, giving you like a podcast like we're doing now. So sharing that one story in different platforms so that you're not kind of neglecting any type of audience in the process. So I remember it was 2014, we were competing in Orlando, and it was like a one-man band competition. And we had to do that. We had to do an article, a photo, and a video in 6 hours. And I panicked. And so we were in a convention center. And I was like, oh, let me just do it about the convention center and like what it takes to put a convention together. Probably the most boring thing anybody could have ever thought of. And I mean, I finished it on time and I was like, yeah, this is great, whatever. I didn't win, like didn't place in anything. So that was just it was the first time in a long time that I hadn't won. And I was like, oh my, like reality check. Mind you, like this is all, the context of this is that I was 16, 17, so I didn't know anything.
Sure.
And then the following year, I went back, my teacher, who's like one of my biggest role models, he was like, okay, let's just not do it again. Like, let's not put you in that competition. I was like, no, let's try again. And that was the story that I mentioned earlier, that I got first place in the country. And it was just like, from being at such like a low point of being like, I've been winning. I don't even place, like people don't even realize that I finished the story. So then the following year doing the exact opposite and winning first place. That was pretty, like, it was good, but it was very scary when it happened at first. And then additionally, I have like, my dream is to be a reporter. And so one of the competitions that we could do was your talent reel. And same thing, the feedback I got was awful. They were like, you speak too fast, your accent is so thick. So those moments obviously make you doubt, especially when you hold this competition world, like scholastic journalism world, at such a high standard. And it kind of is, I wouldn't say it was like the only thing I had going for me, but it was a pretty big deal back then to me, that whenever you hear something that's not what you want to hear, you're like, oh my God. So then obviously you're like, okay, well, I'm going to start taking other classes. I'm going to start doing something else. So you always kind of need that one person to be like, no, like, remember that, okay, you lost one competition, but maybe you won 4. So it's not the end of the world. But yeah, definitely when I got my talent reel feedback and they were essentially like, please get off the air, I was like, what? And then the other competition.
Do you still get feedback on your work even now?
Oh my God, yeah, that's like the first thing I do. So I love getting feedback. I feel like it's a good way to not only humble yourself, which is very necessary in this field, especially when you're starting out. Like the first thing I did at Channel 7, I like walked in and I like scoped the place and I was like, who can I take here and make them kind of like my mentor? And it's Alex Diarmas, she's a morning anchor there. And everything I make, like every single thing, I send it to her and I'm like, hey, this, that, and the other. And then she gives me feedback. I will say that maybe 3-4 years ago, I would ask for feedback kind of like for the courtesy, but anything people would say, I'd be like, whatever, no. Now I'm realizing that when I do apply the things that people tell me, things eventually do get better. But yeah, I love feedback. It's like, because we're in a field in which you need the audience. The audience essentially gives you feedback by watching or not watching. It would be unrealistic for me to be in a vacuum producing content without actually knowing if people are receiving it well and not wanting to learn how I could change that so people do receive it well.
Sounds to me like you're talking to not only the audience of the students in this field, but across the board in all fields, because basically teachers are in the business of giving feedback. And the students, if they take it, then they say, well, why? As an improvement, it can go a different direction. And it says, oh my God, they don't know what they're talking about. Throw the paper in the trash can and walk away. And then you really never learn that skill that, you got all these professional people who are willing to help you to clean up your act and get it better.
I mean, I think it's, like I said, it's the most accurate way to eventually be in those shoes, to hopefully somebody ask me for feedback. like that would be amazing because I would love to get back. I do want to become a reporter. I want to, and I do want to get back into, not back into teaching, but into teaching at some point, even if it's like at a high school, because essentially that's what taught me everything I know. FIU did teach me a couple things here and there, but like my passion, which is kind of like what I would say, like it's the lifeline of my career. It's the passion that you need to have for a field like this. It came from that high school, and it came from like my earlier years at FIU. So yeah, I think giving feedback is important, receiving feedback is important, and it's one of the most, it's vital, I would say. If you're not willing to go through that process of, it's almost like a little vulnerable to be like, well, somebody that actually knows what they're doing and I'm pretending to know what I'm doing is going to look at this and tell me that my little act of here, I'm an aspiring reporter, is not going to cut it. It's scary, but you need to learn to take it. It's necessary. It's vital.
As we say it in other forms, in other industries, you got to develop a thick skin, but open enough where you're listening, not just simply bouncing what one believes to be bad advice off your back. So I'm picking that up from you. You keep mentioning you want to be a reporter. I'm assuming either in front of the camera or in front of the microphone. It could be both, actually. Mm-hmm. But why do you want that? Why do you aspire to that?
Well, for one, I don't see enough people like me on the air, which is sometimes frustrating because it's like, well, I remember when I worked at CNN, I had a conversation with a producer and I was like, why, like, what is happening here? Like, I don't see anybody, like, it could be the best story ever, but I'm not getting it from someone that looks like me, from someone that I could be like, this person relates to me. So I feel like that's huge. I mean, obviously life has a cycle and like people are going to die. And so you need to start replacing the anchors and the reporters that, I don't know how to say this without sounding like super pessimistic, but there needs to be more room for people that are still gonna stick around for a while. And it's not just about like people being born and people dying, but there needs to be a certain place for reporters that look like the audience. Not everybody has like the perfect hair and the perfect face and the perfect teeth to be a reporter. Or I think what big networks are failing to realize is that not every single member of the audience member is in their mid 40s. You know what I'm saying? Like there needs to be more. I think there needs to
diversity.
Be more. Diversity, and not just in the way you look, but your age and your experience.
Actually, you led me into the point of the storytelling. When I was my wife and I, we were in Barcelona. We were watching CNN Barcelona, Spain, and the newscaster was a pregnant lady with only one arm. And with the other arm, she was talking, and she was probably about 7-8 months pregnant. And she had a very long dress because of her pregnancy and all that. So I've never seen that. I think that was awesome. You would see someone in the street, especially with the deformities, and they had no problem putting her in front of the camera. I'd never seen that. I thought that's wonderful to give that kind of an experience to people. And yet, like you say, so much of it, if you change channels, a lot of the people dress the same, talk the same, and they're not like you and I. So we think, okay, what's going on? So it is important. I'd like to, before I go on to the next point, I'd like to ask you, would you be willing to give out a contact information for our audience, for someone to write to you and learn more from you about your field?
Yeah, absolutely. So my handles are the same on every platform. So Twitter and Instagram are really the only two I use. So it's just at Victor, so VICTOR _ Jorges, so JORGES, like Jorge, but with an S at the end. On Twitter and Instagram, I launched like a little digital show in which I give you like the top 3 headlines for the day in South Florida. So if you guys want to check that out, that would be super cool.
How do you build on your skill to become a better storyteller?
The only way to do that, and I'm sure there's people that disagree, but you just got to keep telling stories. Like that's literally the only way to get better at storytelling, is to tell stories. And there might be stories that it might not be the best story, or you might not execute it the same way. But again, it's a combination of what we were talking about earlier. You need to get that feedback. So you tell the story, you get the feedback, you do it again. It's very, as much as creative people and creatives, we love to, deny any sort of like routine in our lives because we want to be like professional hippies. it is a routine. You know, you do the story, you publish it, you get the feedback, you do it again and again and again. That's, in my opinion, is the only way to get better.
When you say improve the story, what's the goal of the story? How does one improve a story?
You need to, it all starts, I think, with, which is something I said in another interview I had, and it's, you have to, and this might be like too philosophical and not answer your question at all, because everything is a story and we're all part of a story, or I mean, I'm not saying we're all part of like the same one big story, because that's also not true, but you have to know, I guess you have to know your story. You have to be okay with your story, and you have to, in a way, fall in love with your own story before you can go out and pretend to tell the story of someone else. Like you, and people think that, oh, well, reporters need to be completely out of the story and be unrelated, and I keep using the word vacuum, but it's not, because we're all human beings and we all have thoughts. So I think that that's a way to improve your story, or I mean any story you're telling, is get to know it, you know, get to see the ins and outs of it, get to know the little like crooks of it, to see if you can go a little deeper. I feel like I mean, a story, for me, a good story is when you finish watching it and you don't have any questions about it. So, and I feel like you learn more of the story to avoid that, asking that question at the end, by falling in love with it, and by knowing, I guess you have to also respect the story enough to say it correctly. So I feel like that's a way to tell a story, because sometimes, I mean, especially right now, working in the 24-hour news cycle, which is probably one of the worst things that could happen to media. It's the same thing for for 24 hours. You burn it out and then you forget about it. That's not respecting the story.
So what is the difference between writing a story as what you do now as a news writer and as a reporter?
Well, I think I've been a reporter for the FIU newspaper for like 2 years now. I think the most obvious difference between the two is the way you write it. Like when you're watching the news, you kind of give the story life again for those 30 seconds, 45 seconds. So you have to write it in present tense. And also, it's just, you need to write very simple, because people, like when let's say you have a newspaper and there's like this huge investigative piece. If you don't understand the sentence that you read, you can read it again. But for the newscast keeps going. So you have to write in a way that everybody understands. I would say the standard, if I'm not mistaken, is like 5th or 6th grade level writing. Like you can't throw big words. That. So I think, you know, the more you write, obviously, the more your vocabulary expands, and you have to make sure that you're writing in a way that everybody understands, and not like just because somebody on the other end of the screen might not know that fancy word you wanted to use, then they completely miss the story, and now you're on to the next story. So you kind of like did them at disservice in a way. So you have to, you know, play fair, and that, I feel like that's the biggest difference.
One more time before I move on is could you please give out your contact information?
Yeah, absolutely. So my Twitter and Instagram handles are at Victor_Jorges, and that's Jorges. That's the last name. And my email, if you guys want to shoot me an email, it's Jorges Victor, so last name, first name, @gmail.com.
Especially people that want to go into the field. I think, you know, you give out some really wonderful advice. So I really thank you for that. The future, I happen to have worked and participated, I still do, with friends in the radio business. And I saw the studios go from a huge crowd of people down to maybe 2 or 3 doing probably more work. Now where it's copied and now it's sent out to many different areas of the country, even though it's in one place. And worse yet, I'm starting to read where more and more news points, whether it be in the magazine or social media, is coming out of artificial intelligence writing that. Okay, so where is the human in all this in the near future?
Wow.
Storytelling, storytelling, Victor, storytelling.
Wow. I mean, honestly, I wasn't very familiar with the like artificial intelligence. The most like tech I've been aware of in storytelling is that you can be speaking and there's like the computer's typing for you. I feel like if that is the case, in which things are becoming artificially produced, then it needs, like, that can't happen. That takes away the magic of journalism, I think, in essence, because at least in Venezuela, like, journalism was classified when you went to school for like higher education under like humanidad, like a humanities, like a social science. The second that you want to save a couple bucks, or you want to like make it more, I guess, techie to be in the future, and you're removing the soul of a story, being the reporter or even being the subject, which I don't really see how a subject could be artificial intelligence. That's a big mistake. I don't think that should happen. I mean, I am aware of the other part of it. The groups that work on a story are becoming smaller. I saw a lot of that CNN en Español, in which a lot of the producers would complain that over at the domestic side, a show would be done with like maybe a group of 6 or 8, but on the Espanol side, it was like the producer, the anchors, and maybe 2 associate producers. So we were constantly running. I don't know if that's true because I didn't see the domestic side, but I could tell you that every single day I walked into CNN, it was like nonstop. For me, because I'm a student, that made me better. But for somebody that is already established and kind of sometimes needs a break, like spreading your people too thin might not be the best idea.
That's an ongoing issue. I do know that the Wall Street Journal uses a lot of the AI articles. And the way I remember being told about this is that if you look at who wrote the story, if it says if it's John or Mary or Juan or Jose, it was written by a person. But you see where it says, I don't know, Media International, chances are it was written by a robot. So now when I read a story, I look for that and I try to figure out, it's really scary issue is this is going across the board. Technology is affecting a lot of the futures, especially employment. But I'll go back to what you said about the idea that this is really a question of the soul of the story. And we don't have AI that has any kind of compassion.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, let's say you're writing a story. My thing is always attaching a person to an issue. So for example, today that I said that international students can't stay in the United States if they don't enroll in face-to-face classes, which is ridiculous because of the pandemic. But let's say if I were to write a story about that, I would mention the law or the executive order if there's going to be one, maybe in the top 2 paragraphs, the first 10 seconds. After that, you immediately switch to a person. You need to learn about someone that's going through it. Otherwise, you're going to forget. So a robot is never going to be able to do that. A robot is never going to be able to call a student who's like let's say my subject is somebody that's about to graduate next semester and I says, you got to get out. A robot is never going to it's never going to pick that up. Again, like the soul of a story needs to be there. And obviously robots don't have souls. So
we could go on with this topic, but I'm just looking more into, we've gone from the past, your present, and into the future in a very short amount of time. Victor, I want to thank you for being on the show. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I'd like to give you some moments for closing statements. But again, I can't thank you enough for being on the program. And you've given us some wonderful advice and a lot to think about, especially for the individuals who are considering the idea of entering your field and going beyond that. So your points as we're ready to close the show.
Well, thanks again for having me. This is fun. I like talking about journalism and not in a way in which they teach it at some universities, especially the university I went to, in which every single class that I took starts as how the printing press revolutionized journalism because the Bible was reproduced so much faster. That's not what journalism is about. Journalism is about passion. Journalism is about sometimes having to put your head down and be like, I have the responsibility of somebody's story in my hands. I need to respect it. I need to fall in love with it. I need to learn when it's okay to take a step away and come back and finish the story. Journalism is probably, I would say, again, this is weird because I've never done anything else, but it might be the very most human choice of work or human career choice that one can make. And that's a huge responsibility. And you can't teach passion, which I feel like is a thing that professors or people in higher education, which is where I'm at right now, forget that. You have to, it takes a very special type of person to be a good journalist. And I hope I'm that type of person, I guess.
Thank you very much. I've been your student all the way through the process of learning as well. I've been taking in what you say. Totally agree with you, that last point. We think about picking up a pen or picking up the story or beginning, middle, end, that whole structure. But passion, the weaving of the emotions in there. I just can't thank you enough for that. Victor, I hope to have you in future shows and continue the discussion about where the industry is going in the future. But unfortunately, we ran out of time. I'm like you, I'm a news writer also, and I have to limit myself to time. Pero muchas gracias. Thank you for being on our show, and I wish you continued success. And I invite the students and individuals who are thinking about this wonderful career to write, to follow you and find out more about the field. And your own life. Thank you, Jorge.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Okay. We've been talking to Victor Jorges. He is in Miami at this moment, actually Fort Lauderdale to be more precise. And he is a news writer at WSBN TV 7 News. And like he says, news is 24/7. So he's never off the clock. I'm sure that he's probably thinking of stories even in his dreams. Thank you very much, Victor. Adios.